Welcome back, historians! Caroline here. In a previous unit, we learned that European empires explored and raced to colonize lands in the New World. England, France, and Spain emerged as the big winners in North America, especially England, with its 1 million colonists on the East Coast. In 1707, during the colonial period, England formed a union with Wales and Scotland and became known as Great Britain. In this unit, we will begin by discussing a major conflict between Great Britain and France that changed the course of North American history. Our objectives are to explain the causes of the French and Indian War and list its combatants, describe the outcome agreed to in the Treaty of Paris of 1763, explain two major problems that remained for Great Britain after the war, and describe the Royal Proclamation of 1763, including the reasons King George enacted the policy. Ready, historians? Great Britain had an economic system called mercantilism. Mercantilism means that the government strictly controls trade to keep a positive trade balance. They want more money coming into Britain than going out. In other words, the king ensured that people exported or sold goods to international customers worth more than the goods they imported or purchased from international sellers. To do this, most empires sought to settle many colonies around the world where natural resources could be extracted and sold to citizens in the ruling country. Those cheap natural resources could be improved and sold back to colonists or international customers for more money.
Boom!
Positive trade balance. And when goods are imported and exported, the king can collect taxes at ports. The thing is, mercantilism only works if you always have cheap natural resources to import. To make sure it wasn't a problem, Great Britain sailed around the world looking for lands to colonize. New lands meant new resources, and colonizing those lands first meant those resources would eventually come back to Britain instead of their rivals, France and Spain. But a problem with continual growth is that Britain must defend lands they claimed. If they didn't defend them, they didn't exactly own them, right? Other empires might just come in, settle, and start taking all the resources for themselves. So the key to holding all of these colonies was to send ships and troops and to build forts to keep an eye on all of the lands. And that can be expensive. Another problem is that there's only so much land out there, right? What happens when all of the places are claimed? How do you expand then? You may remember that Spain and Portugal colonized most of South America, making North America an easier choice for expansion. That's why England, France, the Netherlands, and Sweden all had colonies there. But over time, England, France, and Spain became the only empires that held a big chunk of its lands. And eventually, the influx of settlers caused their empires to grow closer together. In the 1750s, some colonists living further west in Pennsylvania and Virginia were concerned that they would not be able to keep expanding without encountering French troops and their allies, who Americans wrongly called Indians. In 1754, the French army built Fort Duquesne near modern-day Pittsburgh. That year, Benjamin Franklin published this political cartoon, worried that unless people from many colonies banded together, they would be overrun by French settlers. He called upon Americans to work together to challenge the French moving into the Ohio River Valley, even attending the Albany Congress in 1754 to make a plan. Virginia was the biggest colony, with 250,000 inhabitants all on its own. Virginians wanted to settle the Ohio River Valley, and they didn't want to worry about French troops marching through the area. So that fall, a 22-year-old Virginia-born officer in Great Britain's Royal Army was dispatched to Fort Duquesne with 300 men to tell the French to leave. The mission failed miserably. British troops took longer than expected to trek northwest and were not adequately prepared for a cold winter. Then Native American guides inflamed tensions with the French at what should have been a cordial diplomatic meeting. The French framed the encounter as an assassination. A British post, Fort Necessity, was quickly built in a terrible tactical location, giving attackers an advantage over the troops inside. One rainy night that winter, the French attacked and killed or wounded most of the British forces. The young officer failed to drive the French out of Ohio, but was hailed as a hero and thanked by the House of Burgesses. His name? George Washington. Meanwhile, news of the conflict over land between the British and French led to a global war on 5 continents between 1756 and 1763. Europeans called this the 7 Years' War, but most American colonists, who experienced the war only in their own backyard, named it the French and Indian War after their enemies. Great Britain had a population advantage in North America, and along with their indigenous allies, the British were able to defeat the French there. In the end, France gave up all their colonies in North America, splitting them between Great Britain and Spain in the Treaty of Paris of 1763. All lands east of the Mississippi River and in the north were given to Great Britain. All lands west of the Mississippi River were given to Spain. This meant Spain had to give up control of Florida to the British. Keep that in the back of your mind. We'll talk about it later. Although gaining most of France's land was great for British colonists, the French weren't the only ones living in Ohio. Thousands of Native Americans who had not been invited to the peace talks in France did not want British settlers moving into their lands, and they were not willing to stop fighting. It might seem like France was the side that lost the French and Indian War, but we could also argue that France's indigenous allies suffered a worse defeat. A Native American chief, Pontiac, assembled a force of warriors from many tribes in New France. They vowed to attack any colonists that settled in the area and destroy any forts that the British built. They actually succeeded in destroying several English forts in what became known as Pontiac's Rebellion. For colonists to move west, the army would still have to fight for the land. But doing so would mean funding more fighting, and the 7 Years' War was very expensive for Great Britain. Britain's lawmakers, called Parliament, borrowed a lot of money to fight that war, and did not want to borrow any more money to continue fighting Pontiac's forces. The first decision the British made to limit the cost of maintaining land in North America was to allow Pontiac and other Native Americans to live between the Allegheny Mountains and the Mississippi River without any colonial settlement. For now. The king issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763, in which a temporary line was drawn in the mountains that colonists would not be allowed to cross. Colonists who had been willing to fight the French over disputed territory expected to be able to settle the lands they had won. Estimates suggest that almost 7,000 American colonists were killed in action, 6,000 were wounded, and as many as 17,000 may have died of disease during the war. Can you imagine living through that, and then afterward the government says that you can't have what you fought for? How would that make you feel? The Proclamation of 1763 marked the beginning of many new policies made by the king and Parliament. They seemed sensible to government officials, but unfair to the colonists. As we move forward, we'll take a close look at British policies and American colonists' reaction to them. Until then, historians, always be clever. Hey.